and crazy time, not just time. I also thought that Porfirio Diaz said, dictator Porfirio Diaz said, pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, right? So Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, ruthless guy, had some interesting things to say, nevertheless. He said, poor Mexico, so far away from God and so close to the United States. Indeed. I bet you feel that closeness. I wish there was maybe more distance. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Denise Dresser, who will speak about the contemporary situation in Latin America with a focus on the role of the United States in Mexico in particular, but there are many other issues now, like Venezuela and so on, maybe Cuba. After getting her PhD at Princeton, she went to teach at ITAM, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, where she has been since 1991, right? She's among Mexico's most leading intellectuals today, very, very recognized in the country. She has published extensively, both in English and in Spanish. She has a column in a newspaper. She has had programs on television. You even produced a documentary, right? I mean, she just has so many roles. And I should say that during Mexico's darkest moments, she has been a very courageous person who shined light into the to illuminate or to guide a path to more democracy. And you have truly been very, very courageous and taken risks. But during better times, she has also always promoted democracy, human rights. She's very, very active. As I mentioned, she has been here to Berkeley. We have been fortunate to have had her many, many times. And we look forward to having you soon again here and many more times. And with that, please join me in welcoming Denise Dresser.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I consider Berkeley to be my second academic home. I've spent some of my happiest times as a scholar and as an activist and an academic here during my sabbatical. While I was listening to you describe my trajectory, I was thinking, I've spent 30 years of my life defending democracy, transparency, accountability, the rule of law in Mexico, and now I have nothing to show for it. Devoted my life to interior design or something that actually was visible, because I feel that these are dark times on both sides of the border. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Mexico, in a country without a reliable voter ID, without a credencial de elector, that now when I give public talks, I ask people to take out, stroke, kiss, frame, because they may lose it. A country where there was no indelible ink to mark your finger after you voted, where there were no citizens running polling stations. I grew up in a Mexico where the vote was not free, where privacy in the ballot box was not guaranteed, where we had no autonomous electoral authorities, a country without real political competition, where elections were organized by the party that was also the government, for the government. And it was not until the 1990s, after a long period of citizen struggles, partisan pressure, social mobilization, and gradual reforms, that another regime began to take place, the Mexico of the transition. I still remember being an electoral observer for Alianza Cívica in 1994. The first election we had with the semi-autonomous National Electoral Institute. And we were at the polling booths because it was the first time that observers were allowed in Mexican elections. So with that in mind, I see what is happening in Mexico, and I want to focus on domestic politics in my country to begin with, because that's going to explain a great deal of what's happening vis-a-vis the United States. I am of the generation of the transition, and I also spent a lot of time criticizing the flaws of that period from the 1990s onward. The fact that electoral democracy produced basically a rotation of elites, that corruption was not addressed, that longstanding issues of poverty and inequality were also not a priority. And because those issues were not addressed, we are in the situation we are in today. There is a cause and a consequence. And we are living that consequence today because under the presidency of López Obrador and today Claudia Sheinbaum, we are facing a process of democratic erosion, of regression, not an improvement, rather a return to the country we already knew, a return to the cage, as Jorge Barta put it. Because although Claudia Sheinbaum has consolidated her popularity at home, she has 70% approval ratings and is oftentimes acclaimed abroad. She was even on the list of the most stylish people in the world, New York Times, and that's why I'm dressed this way, although I'm competing, and I'm extremely hot. But I think that also reflects what I'm feeling right now about Mexico. I'm hot and I'm angry. Most of the international press, and I think there's blame to be placed, focuses on a similar narrative about our president. She's a woman, she's Jewish, she's a climate scientist, she's popular, and she's standing up to Donald Trump while defending Mexican sovereignty. She's a champion of the poor, and this has led, I think, too many to give her a pass in terms of what's happening to Mexican democracy. The roots of her popularity are similar to those of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a shift from flawed representative democracy to what they have called true participatory democracy, public policies geared towards the poor, and that is something to be recognized and applauded. 13 million people lifted from poverty. And she's also shown, as he did, a deference to Donald Trump's demands in order to avoid conflict or retaliation. And propelled by this popularity, Sheinbaum has become an icon for progressives worldwide. And as a result, oftentimes controversial reforms that have been passed under her presidency are often overlooked or disregarded. And attention seems to focus largely on the border, on tariffs, on the free trade agreement, on guns and thugs, on cartels, violence, and insecurity. But that narrow focus is ignoring a more significant and troublesome development. I had a conversation with Steve Levitsky about this recently, and we both agreed that Mexico is sliding into competitive authoritarianism, a regime type where opposition parties still compete in elections, but they can never win the presidency back because the playing field has been tilted in the favor of the party that is the government, el partido gobierno. So the trappings of democracy, perhaps some of you will say, but they've elected their judges. That is a true sign of real democracy. Those trappings have been grafted onto an undemocratic system where competition is now unfair. Institutions have been captured by the ruling party. The judiciary is being weaponized against opponents, and critics are treated as illegitimate. And full disclosure, I voted for López Obrador 3 times. Mea culpa. But I don't want anyone here to say, oh, but your criticism comes from the right. You're a panista. No, on the contrary, I always have believed that Mexico needs a progressive government. We're not there. And I spent most of the López Obrador sexenio litigating against a government that I had voted for because I was constantly mentioned in the morning press conference and sued twice by a senator who's now running for the governorship of Chihuahua, Andrea Chavez, for political gender violence, which is a way in which critics are being silenced in Mexico today. So Sheinbaum has continued with López Obrador's capture of the state, elimination of checks and balances on the power of the executive, and has embraced that agenda in an even more systematic fashion. And I say that this is true in 3 areas. One is the way in which Morena achieved a supermajority in Congress. They did not win enough of the vote in 2024, although she won with a landslide, to get a supermajority in Congress. But then, and you can ask me this in the Q&A, through a series of legal maneuverings and buying off the vote of a panista senator, they managed to get a supermajority. And now that means that Morena can pass legislation on its own, reform the Constitution on its own, without having to take the opposition into account at all. And on the basis of this supermajority, we got constitutional reforms that eliminated the National Transparency Institute, the Competition Commission, the Telecoms Commission, all independent, autonomous regulatory institutions that were created by people like me in the 1990s because we had come from 60 years of an overextended, omnipotent president, and survivors of the 1976, 1982, 1994 economic crises, plus the years of fraud carried out by the party government. The solution for us seemed to be take power away from the presidency. Now we're seeing that that power is being returned by the absorption of the executive of everything that was created to be and act as a check and balance. So the supermajority has led to these reforms. Second is reform of the judiciary, which was the election of federal judges and all members of the Supreme Court. I was an observer for the National Electoral Institute at that election. And many of you may say, oh, but it sounds great, electing judges and members of the Supreme Court. I wish you would have been there that day. There were cheat sheets handed out by Morena that corresponded to the people who actually won the election. And in order to win the presidency of the Supreme Court, all you needed was win a majority of votes. And the requisites were have a B average in college, 5 letters of recommendation from your neighbors. So now we have a Supreme Court that is controlled, dominated by the ruling party and federal judges as well. When I litigated in López Obrador's sexenio, I actually won my 3 cases because we had a semi-autonomous professionalized court system where people like me could use an amparo, a stay, against abusive government acts. I would never be able to win that case again. And this is what is happening to critics that are now being put at the mercy of a politicized partisan judiciary and accused of political gender violence or whatever spurious claim in order to silence critics and to silence the press. And the third area that is of concern regarding Mexico's democracy today is the electoral reform that Claudia Sheinbaum has announced is coming down the pipes. And it entails, we don't know what the initiative, the legislative initiative is because it hasn't been released, but we clearly can discern its intentions. It is being touted as Mexican democracy should cost less. So let's cut public funding for parties, which sounds great. It's something that many of us championed in the 1990s, and Morena, back then the PRD, never supported it. Because when you're an opposition party, of course you want to you don't want to cut party financing because you depend on it. When you're in power, Morena wants to take away public financing for the opposition because even if their budget is reduced, they have access to state resources. They've talked about the reform containing the elimination of proportional representation, perhaps voting the members of the INE, Mexico's Autonomous Electoral Institute, voting them in via the popular vote, which would lead to capture that has already partially taken place. And it would also perhaps entail everything that has to do with leveling the playing field that was the big challenge and the big issue in the 1990s. Promote competition, allow for alternancia, and create conditions so that the competition, the opposition, can win. Even by a minimalist definition of democracy, Adam Przeworski, democracy is parties that lose elections. Mexico is now entering an era where those basic conditions of democracy are being eliminated, where Morena will compete, but will not lose. Or it could lose a couple of state elections or municipal elections, but we're back to an era where when the ruling party announced who its presidential candidate would be, we already knew who was going to win. And sadly, the Mexican opposition that could capture eventually the voto de castigo, because if you look at the polls, Claudia Sheinbaum is very popular, but a more granular delving into public opinion reveals that the government is reprobado in terms of its handling of the economy, its handling of public insecurity, its handling of corruption. So there's this essential contradiction that was also the case in López Obrador's term. And that contradiction was a popular president with a government that does not produce the desired results, but manages to maintain its popularity also on the basis of its social policy, based on cash handouts to the poor. I have nothing against them. I would have supported universal basic income. The problem is that it resurrects the old clientelist machinery that the PRI had put into place, because there's no transparency in terms of how these cash disbursements are given out. And there's a whole other issue of whether this model is sustainable given the lack of growth in the Mexican economy. And while perhaps some of you may say, but she's truly putting the poor first. Take a look at Oxfam studies of the concentration of wealth in Mexico, and you will see who the beneficiaries of the fourth transformation have truly been. It would be Carlos Slim and the 14 multimillionaires on the Forbes list who are dancing for joy because the independent regulators have been eliminated. So crony capitalism is alive and well. And as a result of that, you probably have seen, if you're paying attention, numerous corruption scandals involving members of the ruling party, of López Obrador's family. And these scandals revolve around contracts being assigned, public contracts in a discretionary and illegal fashion, to friends, public officials, business tycoons allied with the government. And this has tainted the public works of the past administration, El Tren Maya, Dos Bocas, and other infrastructure projects carried out in absolute opacity. If you still have an argument against me as to why I shouldn't be assuming this position because Mexico's democracy is more vital than ever, I'd like you to remind you that this has proceeded hand in hand with the militarization of the Mexican economy, of Mexican politics. The military today is in control of the airports, the aduanas, transportation, the highways. What country in the world subcontracts its policing to military forces? And the military, and for the first time, you are witnessing what many of us have been alerting to in Mexico for years. What happens when you create a paramilitary force that is loyal to the president, that roves around the country like the National Guard in Mexico and is accountable to no one? What you have witnessed on the streets of Minneapolis is what we see on highways in Mexico City every couple of weeks, with the National Guard actually killing a civilian and nobody is held into account. So, and the opposition cannot capitalize on this because of its own divisions, its incapacity to provide a real alternative. The only thing the fund and the free offer is a return to the past, which was summarily voted out in 2018 and 2024. And so I finished this part of the presentation arguing that Mexico needs to be placed in the category of competitive authoritarianism. It hasn't, it's eluded that scrutiny. It's not placed next to examples like Hungary, El Salvador, India, Tunisia, Turkey, never Mexico. Well, a closer examination, as I have provided, of the country's political dynamics urges you to place it on the list of regressive regimes, because what is happening in Mexico is going to have profound impacts for a generation in my country, and is also affecting Mexico's relations with the United States. Now, as I speak, you are thinking all of this sounds familiar because you're beginning to experience it and live it in this country in terms of conflicts of interest in the ruling elite, skewering the media, lambasting judges, overstepping the Constitution, politicizing the judiciary. Welcome to my world. And welcome to Mexico for most of its history under the PRI, and now his history resurrected under the PRI Morena. So there are troubling parallels taking place. The fourth transformation in Mexico, make America great again in the United States, and democratic backsliding in both countries, I argue, is turning erstwhile partners into something much more conflict-ridden in terms of their relationship, and threatening a 30-year vision of a more integrated, collaborative North America. And so while the international image of Claudia Sheinbaum portrays her as a level-headed president who is forcefully standing up to Donald Trump and has been baptized as the Trump whisperer, the reality is much more complex. And behind the triumphant facade of resistance, the administration has complied to each and every one of Donald Trump's demands. And Mexico has received some tariff relief. But at the same time, if you look behind the scenes, the Sheinbaum administration has made more concessions to the United States than any of its predecessors in the time that I have been a political analyst in Mexico. I'm not going to delve in deeply into democratic backsliding into the United States, because You're living it. And I also, I coincide, I share the views of Ziblatt, Levitsky, Lucan Way, the article they published on American authoritarianism in foreign affairs. And I would argue that that democratic backsliding in the United States also explains why Trump has been able to advance the Donroe doctrine, basically unrestrained by Congress or tempered by any other institution within this country. So with barely a year in office, we've seen an American president who's blown up agreements and pushed his country towards an unthinkable destination of an elected autocracy. Empowered by the will of the people, he is bulldozing every institution he sees as a constraint on his power and crossing lines that we've never seen any American president cross, such as the deployment of ICE in American cities. And the images speak for themselves. You've seen them. Armed soldiers patrolling the streets, helicopters hovering over peaceful protests, arrests without warrants. This aggressiveness does not stop at the US border. You've seen it with Greenland, with Venezuela, and he's sending an unmistakable message. The United States strikes when it wants, where it wants, and to whom it wants. So it's the new version of the Monroe Doctrine, stripped of euphemisms and diplomacy, a blunt assertion that the hemisphere is America's backyard. And not vis-a-vis necessarily Russia in the context of the Cold War, but China. It is a message to China to get out of the hemisphere and also to Russian influence in Latin American elections, as has been happening. And what is significant, and I'd say striking, is Latin American acquiescence. Governments that used to bristle at American intervention are now keeping silent. We've even seen it in the case of the strike, the decapitation of the Maduro regime, insofar as crime, insecurity, drug trafficking become the predominant agenda in Latin America. You now see people in the hemisphere and leaders in the hemisphere welcoming Trump's strikes because they believe that this will help the context of insecurity they live in. So the Mexican right, for example, is basically inviting Trump into Mexico with the argument that American pressure is the only thing that is going to clean up the narco state. So the so-called Donroe Doctrine is more than a pun, it's a strategy. Venezuela is pushed into essentially protectorate. Cuba remains suffocated by sanctions on the verge of collapse, and Mexico is told to do what? Militarize its borders, take in immigrants, strike against drug cartels with American intelligence, and possibly joint military operations or boots on the ground, as Trump has said. And the implications are corrosive. Because the Donroe Doctrine, if you think about it, is incentivizing strong men or strong women, weakening regional multilateralism, hollowing out democratic norms by rewarding those who govern in an authoritarian fashion, as long as they do so in tandem with Washington's interest. And Mexico is in the crosshairs. The US is no longer treating Mexico as a difficult partner or a necessary neighbor. Mexico is now a national security problem. Trump says it all the time. The cartels now run Mexico. And in Washington, organized crime is being redefined not as a law enforcement challenge or a bilateral cooperation issue, but as an external threat akin to terrorism. And once the threat is defined, pressure is no longer bounded by diplomacy. So that's why you see American drones flying over Mexico, operations to decapitate cartel leaders that happen overnight. And then Claudia Sheinbaum in the morning press conference is asked about it. And she may not even know, but she is forced to say that it's a new form of collaboration with the United States. And Trump's remarks on Fox News recently about hitting on land in Mexico were not an improvisation. This is what the Trump administration would love to do. Because of the November election, having the Mexican piñata is very useful. And Washington is trying to build a political narrative that striking Mexico would be a political gain for the fight on insecurity and drugs. And so cooperation is no longer viewed as an intelligence sharing issue or joint investigations, but possible coercion applied on Claudia Sheinbaum. And if you look at Venezuela, you'll understand why every other leader in the region is living in fear. And as you probably know, the objective was never just Maduro as an individual. It was oil. It was imposing a government more pliable to U.S. interests, the interests of his family, his allies, the crony capitalists surrounding him. And capturing or removing a dictator was never a guarantee of democracy in Venezuela, as we're seeing, because the architecture of Chavismo perfected by Maduro is still in place. And he's not seeking to dismantle that system. Trump wants to insert himself into it, replace a hostile kleptocracy with a more subordinate one. And this brings to mind that famous phrase, the Franklin Roosevelt phrase, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So that could apply to Delcy Rodriguez and increasingly to Claudia Sheinbaum, because in the American perspective, Mexico's shift into or regression into authoritarianism, populismo punitivo, everything that accompanies militarization is not a concern for Marco Rubio or for the president. On the contrary, Mexico is a country to be domesticated, a potential target of the Donroe doctrine, limited only by what Trump said was his own morality. And if you look at the indictment against Maduro in the American court system, Mexico is mentioned 25 times because there was a route of drugs from Venezuela to Mexico. The indictment talks about El Chapo using the presidential hangar in Venezuela to transport drugs to Mexico. The Cartel de Sinaloa was connected to Miraflores and corridors crossing Mexican territory. And for the White House, the map is already drawn. So the real question is, what will Sheinbaum do? She is trapped because new collaboration, as she says in the morning press conference, will probably mean deeper U.S. involvement. Intelligence dominance, operational presence, joint actions framed as pragmatism. And she's trapped between doctrine and reality, between Mexico's historic commitment to non-intervention and the geopolitics of punishment. And she is not negotiating from a position of strain, but from accumulated fragility. 6 years of López Obrador, of abrazos no balazos, 6 years of dismantling professional democracy, hollowing out the state, denying the fentanyl crisis, tolerating criminal behavior, corroding the rule of law, and protecting the cartel that Morena has become in terms of the relations between top-level Morena politicians and drug trafficking. So López Obrador left behind a weakened house, and Trump has arrived with a battering ram. So in this new world, sovereignty is no longer violated by invasion, but by conditions, by deadlines, by tariffs. In the past, bilateral relations were put in many baskets. So the US negotiated with Mexico, water here, tariffs here, trade, security. And now everything has been put into the same basket. And tariffs and the renegotiation of the USMCA are being weaponized to force Claudia Sheinbaum to accept what previous presidents would have been considered intolerable in terms of the crackdown on crime and criminal cartel activity that, as Mary Beth Sheridan's piece in today's New York Times argues, I think so intelligently, it's not that in Mexico the cartels are here and the government is here. It's more of a Venn diagram. And how do you root out that criminal complicity at the helm of the Mexican state? So the danger for Mexico is not only miscalculating, and that's why you see Claudia Sheinbaum trying to keep a level head, trying to not respond, trying to not be confrontational like Petro, who then later ended up basically genuflecting to Trump in the White House. The problem is habituation, that Mexico learns to live with the unacceptable, living under the pressure on probation at the whim of a man who governs like a would-be Tlatuani, and we have had many of those. So I'm going to conclude with a final message on what this means for Mexicans and for those who love the country sitting here, and for bilateral relations. I come from your future. The erosion of democracy is something that happens without people necessarily being aware of it. As Anne Applebaum says, democracy is like water from a tap. You open up the tap and you always think that water will run out. And it's only one day that you open the tap and nothing's there that you realized what has happened while you weren't paying enough attention. Disaffected people empower populist authoritarians and vote for autocrats when they feel that liberal democracy is not working for them. Democracy can die to the roar of popular applause. It can be dismantled in the absence of a robust opposition capable of stopping what is happening. And authoritarian populism, north of the border, south of the border, is a permanent shadow of representative politics. It indicates that the people feel underrepresented and should force defenders of democracy, you, to address failures of representation, of inclusion, before it becomes too late and democratic backsliding leads to competitive authoritarianism or worse. So in this sense, I'd like to point out what should be an obvious point. Those who are critical of Trump cannot be at the same time positive about Claudia Sheinbaum. Despite their differences in style and gender, they have more in common than has been acknowledged. This is a tragedy that both Mexicans and Americans deserve to know, so that they can figure out if they're going to be accomplices of backsliding or citizens who try to stop it from taking place. Mexico no longer views the U.S. as a reliable partner, and the Trump administration's view of Mexico does not bode well for the future either. What we're seeing is both countries undergoing democratic backsliding, sliding away from democracy and from the consensual collaboration with each other. Trump is resurrecting the era of the ugly American, while Mexico is sliding back into what was known as the perfect dictatorship. Do we really want to go there? As novelist Milan Kundera wrote, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And we are forgetting. Thank you very much. What did they? Yes, I'll take the questions, comments. And now that I've iPod right up there with Claudia Sheinbaum. Please.
One question. I thought you were going to talk a bit about Cuba. How does Cuba play into this?
I actually think that that Trump does not have an end game for Cuba. because the end game, or at least the initial step in Venezuela was replace a hostile individual with a group that one can negotiate with. That would probably be the end game in Cuba, because there isn't an opposition. There's no party, there's no alternative to what would be a different government. I think that Trump plans to strangle Cuba as quickly as he possibly can, and therein the pressure on Mexico to stop selling or giving oil to Cuba that happened over the past week, that demand, and it Sheinbaum acquiesced, although she later said that this was an act of sovereignty. So strangle the island into acquiescence, and probably reach some kind of negotiation with Díaz-Canel or someone else who would replace him and be pliant, as Delcy Rodriguez is proving to be. Yes.
Thanks, this is really incredible talk. It's hard to take on an authoritarian who's at 70% approval. Trump is at 40%. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about why she is so popular. And I'm wondering, you didn't say anything about the role of the media, and it seems like in democratic backsliding, the role of the media is often very important, capture of the media. So I don't know if that's part of the explanation, or I'd be just curious why she's so popular.
Thank you. It's a very important question. I think her popularity stems a great deal from the control of the narrative that comes from the morning press conference. As you know, she's out there every morning, perhaps not as eloquently or with less charisma than López Obrador, but framing the way in which issues should be understood. And there is a vast coterie of bloggers, YouTubers, those who go to the morning press conference on a daily basis and then reproduce that message. And in a parallel fashion, you've seen a decimation of the independent media in Mexico. I used to be on Televisa, a show called La Hora de Opinar, until we were beheaded, metaphorically speaking, about a year and a half ago, when Televisa, that, as if you know the history of Mexico, for a long time viewed itself as a soldier of the president. Then there was a period of promoting democratization, opening pluralism on Mexican media, and I was a beneficiary of that. And now Televisa is going back to its being a soldier of the president, in this case, Claudia Sheinbaum. So and that in parallel with the fact that traditional journalism, as you know, is under siege for other reasons that have nothing to do with politics. But there has been a clear mandate or a clear operation carried out from the National Palace from Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, who's like the Rasputin in terms of controlling the media. And what we're witnessing is no longer what the PRI used to do, which was overt censorship. They co-opted you or they killed you. Now it's character assassination. Being sued for by a politician and being taken to court for sullying that politician's name, being sued for political gender violence, which consumes years of your time and lawyers and going through the court system. And these have become strategies with which to silence independent voices. So if you look at the Mexican media landscape today, there are oftentimes days when the front page of the newspapers, they all have the same message. And that message was orchestrated by the National Palace. So it's a return to the kind of media coverage that we saw in the 1980s. And now you're experiencing it in the United States. Trump suing the New York Times, suing CBS, and then techno-oligarchs allying themselves with the president. In the Mexican case, it's media oligarchs allying themselves with the Claudia Sheinbaum government. And you get outcomes such as the one you're seeing in at the Washington Post today. So when I talk about defending democracy, it goes way beyond defending elections. It's defending freedom of the press, defending civil oversight of the military. It's defending the courts. It's defending the independence or the autonomy of the Attorney General's office, things that in the United States may already be lost. And I don't know if they can be corrected with an opposition win in the midterms and a possible win by the Democrats in a recovery of the House. The problem with Democratic backsliding is it's insidious. It can happen very quickly, and it's accompanied by total control of the apparatus of the state, or the decimation of the apparatus of the state, as you've seen with USAID, the State Department. All of that has happened already in Mexico. I talked about the United Competition Commission, the only Coneval, the only institution that actually measured poverty. So how are we supposed to criticize or correct public policies if we can't measure what the government is doing? So, and the narrative is the same. It's, we have to drain the swamp, go against elites, go against technocrats, go against the corrupt forces of the past, the long night of neoliberalism. And that entails essentially state capture or state decimation. Nice to see you.
How are you? Brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. Going back to Mary Beth's piece today, she mentions that Talia is in a bind because members of her own party are in cahoots with drug dealers. However, unlike the pre, she doesn't have the control of the party. The pre-presidential system, as soon as the president chose his successor, everything moved to him. And in this case, it's not the same. Do you see any chance that she will bite the bullet and go after those that are?
No.
I was afraid of that.
Do you want me to elaborate? It's true. She's not totally in control of her party, but with electoral reform, she will be. Because there will come a time when lists of candidates will be elaborated and she will check them off. And given, I mean, there's a strategic reason why she eliminated re-election, which we only had for 6 years. It's a key factor to assuring discipline within the ruling party. Because you, as a member of Morena, your permanence within the party does not depend on your constituents. It depends on discipline and loyalty to the president. And also the fact that she will have the dedazo, which is the other condition for presidentialism. And the third condition is unified government. So we are quickly nearing the 3 conditions that explain the imperial presidency in Mexico. And yes, there are partisan splits. There are people who are opposer. They have their fiefdoms within Morena. But remember, she was put into office. There was a dedazo. I mean, it was semi-disguised by a primary that she allegedly won. But she was put into office by Andrés Manuel López Obrador. She is not going to break with him. Why would she? He still remains popular. Presidents broke with their predecessors because their predecessors left office in disgrace, which is not the case with López Obrador. In the best case scenario, I'd see a couple of human sacrifices, testimonial tokens being shipped across the border, but not a complete an undertaking to clean the party. I mean, Morena's victories, many of them, as you know, on the states in the Pacific, mobilization by drug traffickers, who are now fielding candidates, electing judges, and infiltrating many state governments. They already done so.
Hi, thank you for this conference. My name is Peter. What do you recommend? I was a journalist in Mexico for many years, and that piece is incredible, but I'm also worked at the Washington Post until recently, was amongst those laid off recently, but not before it's not.
Do you mind speaking up a little more
Yes.
so that people can?
Yeah, so my question is, I'm sitting here mumbling to myself, the state of journalism in our country. But my question is, where do you go for information in Mexico? Where do you recommend for folks here to go and find information in Mexico? And secondly, where do you see points of light in terms of activism and civic participation and folks who are mobilizing in the younger generation who see what's happening? It's that twofold.
Where do I go to, there are a couple of people who I follow intensely on Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter, so if you follow my feed, you'll know who I follow, like Animal Político, clearly, Reforma, some editorialists and analysts. But as I said, the media landscape is becoming increasingly captured. I follow a series of organizations that have acted as analysts of public policy for years, such as México Unido contra la Delincuencia, México Evalúa, Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, that are trying to actually dissect the numbers and provide analysis based on real data, whatever data that they can find, and not on what the government disseminates. So anyone who's managed to maintain independence, autonomy, credibility, and I also follow Latinos because Torete Mola has evolved into whatever you think of him, and as well as Carmen Aristegui, they remain. They are voices that are continually trying to push the government into accountability, revealing uncomfortable investigations carried out by independent journalism. And then the points of light. I like to think that eventually my students, who now are very worried about their country and worried about where they're going to work, what it entails to be a citizen, what the future looks like, will they be able to study in the United States, those sorts of concerns. How do you integrate it into an economy with 0.7% growth and negative GDP growth over the last 7 years? I want to believe that eventually my students are going to take to the streets as many people did in the 1980s, because we've already seen this story. Morena is going to commit abuses. Morena is going to commit fraud. Corruption scandals will continue. In an economy that isn't growing, how long can you continue to redistribute a cake whose size does not grow? How sustainable is social policy that provides a big base of electoral support to the government? How sustainable is that with zero growth? So those are the conditions that led to discontent in the 1980s. And what happened? People started taking to the streets to protest fraud, corruption, economic debacles, etc. And we'll see that same cycle. I don't know when that will happen, perhaps not in my lifetime, but the same impulses that led people to protest against abuse, because that's the issue with authoritarian populist regimes of the left or of the right. They are governments that act without constraints. They trample your rights as a citizen. They take away your rights. The amparo that I use to protect myself from the government has now, there's been a reform to the ley de amparo. I can no longer use that vehicle, or it's become much harder. So eventually people will begin to see what the election of the judiciary means for their lives, how their trial over the custody of their children takes forever because you've had to restart trials with the election of judges, and these judges are more open to corruption than they were in the past. What it entails to litigate as a citizen against a judiciary that is captured by the government, all that will create discontent. Now, there's not a receptacle for that discontent. There's not an opposition capable of capitalizing on that. I think eventually that will grow, but how does that opposition win when electoral reforms have already tilted the playing field? So you're going to see history repeat itself, and young people demanding an autonomous electoral institute and clean elections and the combating corruption. I think my point, and people are starting to realize this, and this is why you see the negative evaluations in the polls, is that Morena presented us with a false dichotomy. Let people out of poverty and sacrifice democracy to obtain that purpose, to achieve that purpose. When you could have done the first without sacrificing the second. But the objective is to become a dominant party regime. Because when you're a member of a dominant party regime, life's great. Cartloads of public money, zero accountability. Yes.
Hi, I'm curious about your perspective on how you think how you predict the ongoing tensions between the bilateral relationship of the U.S. and Mexico, as well as I know I'm in the back. I'm curious as to what you predict the ongoing tensions between the bilateral relationship, as well as the recent enactment of the tariffs against China will impact the review that comes up of DEMEC in July, and how that future will look like for Mexico.
If I had to make a prediction, I would say Claudia Sheinbaum will continue to make concessions to Trump. In the morning press conference, she will say, I am defending Mexican sovereignty. We are not a colony. We will never be submissive to anyone. And that message will be disseminated, and she will be applauded for that. And in the afternoon, she will make concessions that are not publicly revealed, and we'll only find out about them later. Because first of all, she's in a context of vulnerability, given the high levels of infiltration of crime and drug trafficking in many levels of the state. And secondly, because if Mexico were to be kicked out of the USMCA, the fourth transformation would be over. Because its demise would be accelerated, because Mexico would go into a spiral of capital flight, what has kept Mexico's economy afloat in the midst of a series of reforms that are self-inflicted wounds has been the USMCA. What I predict will happen is that Mexico will obey in advance, as it already did, by placing tariffs on Chinese imports in Mexico, even prior to the renegotiation of the USMCA. So, as I said, offering tributes to Trump so that when the review takes place, Mexico will not be punished as severely as some people think it may. And it will be punished already for things that happened under López Obrador that go against specific commitments of the USMCA, like the fact that we no longer have autonomous regulatory institutions, there's no longer a competition commission, judicial reform that leads to uncertainty in terms of the investment climate, a series of moves that place Mexico in a context, I'd say, of extreme vulnerability vis-a-vis Trump. And as I said, I think that Trump will continue to pressure for joint military operations, which have not happened in Mexican soil as long as I can remember. And if I were to make a prediction, I would say that those will happen, if they're not happening already. Yes.
For that great talk and, very provocative analogies, One thing I wanted to ask is, in relation to the international relations part. Now, Canadian Prime Minister Carney gave a fantastic at Davos, Canadian superstar overnight, for provoking really the middle states, right, to act differently, to not necessarily defer to the hedge fund, right? In this case is obviously the US, and really trying to figure out a different alignment, a different maybe set of alignments that can happen. And I'm just wondering, how realistic is that scenario for Mexico? I mean, like, this is a northern border. Canada is just a northern part. But how realistic is that for Mexico in the southern part? You really think completely.
I was impressed by the Carney's speech. I found out recently from a Canadian colleague close to the Carney administration that he wrote it himself. Claudia Sheinbaum applauded it. But the scenario of Mexico assuming the Canadian position is completely unrealistic. I mean, Canada has been working strategically for months now to strengthen its security relations with Europe. Carney went to China. Now there's a whole commercial deal taking place between Canada and China. And Canada is in a much more robust position economically and in terms of security than Mexico is. The engine of Mexico's economy is basically exports to the American market. What is it, 80% of our trade is with the United States. We are wholly dependent on the USMCA. So Sheinbaum can say that she loved Carney's speech, and in another world, she would like to be Carney, but she can't be Carney because of Mexico's imbalance in power. We are not a median middle income, and Canada's not a middle income country anyway. I mean, Canada is an industrial capitalist strong economy. Mexico is sliding away from what used to be, I think, very positive prospects of us joining the BRICS, etc. But if you look at the behavior of the Mexican economy over the last 7 years, not only in terms of growth, but competitiveness, productivity, shifting towards renewables. Here you say, oh, she's a climate scientist. Oh, she's a climate scientist who has just spent a significant part of the budget on Femex, which is basically burning money, and who has reinstated. This is another issue that's going to be sticky for the USMCA, which is going back to Femex and the Federal Electricity Commission as being state players in the energy field. So she's a climate scientist who is not pushing actively for renewables. So Mexico is sadly backsliding, I'd say, not only in terms of its democracy, but it's competing for investment with the rest of the world. And why is investment flocking to Brazil? Because Brazil has acted strategically, has strengthened its relations with China, has diversified its sources of trade, and that has not been the Mexican case. And yes.
Given this new doctrine by and this emphasis by Trump about the hemisphere, is there any discussions, I don't know, how is Latin America reacting to this? Are they concerned? Are they taking it seriously?
What was striking was essentially the silence in Latin America after the Maduro operation. And I referred to this in my talk, that what's been striking has been the acquiescence, because now many leaders in Latin America want to be in Trump's good graces. They know that there's a penalty if you're not, and Petro learned this the hard way. Even after what happened in Venezuela when Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and maybe it was Chile, I don't remember, put out a communique decrying the American intervention. Claudia Sheinbaum didn't even post it on the website. She didn't tweet it. She didn't talk about it in the morning press conference. It was like, I'm going to say that I oppose the US intervention, but not really. And I think that's what's happening to many other leaders in the hemisphere, because, and this is the brilliance in a perverse way of the Donroe doctrine, which is keep everyone guessing. And it works domestically and it works internationally, which is you never know who the next target is going to be. I assume Petro stopped sleeping in the presidential palace or wherever he sleeps after Maduro was captured. And maybe López Obrador is bed hopping as well, because now you know that that is a real possibility. And even though it went against multilateralism, international law, American law, and I mean the US president overstepping Congress, you didn't even see there's a lack of reaction even here.
Yes.
To the American president breaking the law. So if there's no reaction here, well, what do you expect from Latin Americans that are leaders that are in a much more vulnerable position, especially when tariffs are being weaponized to extract concessions on multiple other fields like security, immigration control, drugs, etc.
What about the reaction of people in Latin America? Is there a way to know? I get it that leaders are concerned. They want to be in Trump's good graces, but
You know, I saw a fascinating poll where the majority of people in Latin America were supportive of Trump's intervention in Venezuela, with the exception of Mexico. And this is paradoxical because Mexico is the country that is making the most concessions, but Sheinbaum has, I think, very intelligently crafted a narrative that sadly, I think the foreign press reproduces, while the rest of Latin America, for issues that I mentioned in my talk, because crime and insecurity and corruption and drug trafficking are top of mind, you see unexpected sources of support for American intervention to decapitate rulers that have let those problems fester in their own countries. And that explains also the support for Bukele and others. Yes.
Follow up a little bit on Professor Maz's point, which is to what degree is the silence in Latin America partly due to the fact that Maduro, the destruction of Venezuela, the 8 million people flooding other countries, please fix this.
Exactly. Yes, it's the strong man. Take care of this problem. It doesn't matter if you break the law. It doesn't matter if you violate every international treaty, accord that you have formed part of. Just take care of the problem. And as I said, Bukele is the example. He is the most popular leader in Latin America today. And how has he achieved that popularity? It's by reducing levels of insecurity, even if that entails sacrificing civil rights, democratic rights, and in all likelihood, he's going to perpetuate himself in power. And when Salvadorans realize that, I don't know what percentage of the population is in jail with no expectation of ever being freed, or that if you suffer the abuse of power of the government, you have no way to defend yourself, then it's going to be too late. Yes.
Do you think Trump will succeed in making Latin America its backyard? And I'm talking about China's importance in the region. I mean, Brazil cannot sell its soybean to America like it does to China. Peru cannot sell its minerals to the US as much as it does to China. Isn't there something near there that Trump is trying to do something, but he's already lost ground against his friends?
I think that it may be too late for certain countries because Biden was quite disengaged from Latin America. And China made huge inroads in terms of ports, investment in infrastructure. I think that the Chinese presence in Mexico is much higher in investment terms than has actually been reported. And China has been doing this for years. So perhaps if Trump's objective is to bring Latin Americans back into the fold, his aggressive stance may actually below the scenes lead leaders to try and protect themselves by diversifying their ties. Mexico isn't thinking that way, and they're the imposition on Chinese goods even before the USMCA review began. And I think Trump was also concerned, or the Trump people were concerned about Russia's presence in the hemisphere in terms of election interference and social media and undermining the narratives of democracy. And I've been in Ukraine twice, and I remember going to a foundation that raises money for troops, and their website was in Ukrainian and in Spanish. I said, well, why in Spanish? And he said, because we've realized that Russia's interference in the world is at its highest level in Spanish-speaking countries.
Mhm.
And we're trying to counter this. And you probably read, I think it was maybe the Post, the New York Times, the expose on all of these Russian spies now operating out of the Mexican embassy, the Russian embassy in Mexico City. People who were kicked out of Europe after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, who were warmly received in Mexico, and who now use that as a base of operations for supporting certain candidates in Latin America and vilifying others. This is another way of playing Cold War politics. And Mexico, sadly, became a receptive country to that. As you know, López Obrador did not condemn the Russian invasion. He adopted a position of neutrality, which in this situation, as Zelensky said, it's sad to see a country that was invaded not support us. And I think it's something that's happening as we speak, which is Russia isn't necessarily investing money in Latin America, but it is investing resources in affecting the outcome of elections. Yes.
As we speak, what's happening in Costa Rica? Where do you put Costa Rica on the spectrum?
I confess not having deep knowledge or an opinion. This is novel for me, believe me, not having an opinion, but I actually don't, so I would feel intellectually dishonest in answering that question. Well, thank you so much. Unless there's another question, comment. Thank you for being here. I hope you appreciated the
Thank
conversation.
you so much.
Thank you.